The Economy of Machinery and Manufactures by Charles Babbage 1832. Introduction. The object of the present volume is to point out the effects and the advantages which arise from the use of tools and machines, to endeavor to classify their modes of action, and to trace both the causes and the consequences of applying machinery to supersede the skill and power of the human arm. The view of the mechanical part of the subject will, in the first instance, occupy our attention, and to this the first section of the work will be devoted. The first chapter of the section will contain some remarks on the general sources from whence the advantages of machinery are derived, and the succeeding 9 chapters will contain a detailed examination of principles of a less general character. The 11th chapter contains numerous subdivisions, and is important from the extensive classification it affords of the arts in which copying is so largely employed. The 12th chapter, which completes the first section, contains a few suggestions for the assistance of those who propose visiting manufactories. The second section, after an introductory chapter on the difference between making and manufacturing, will contain, in the succeeding chapters, a discussion of many of the questions which relate to the political economy of the subject. It was found that the domestic arrangement, or interior economy of factories, was so interwoven with the more general questions, that it was deemed unadvisable to separate the two subjects. The concluding chapter of this section, and the work itself, relates to the future prospects of manufactures, as arising from the application of science. Chapter 1. Sources of the advantages arising from machinery and manufactures. 1. There exists, perhaps, no single circumstance which distinguishes our country more remarkably from all others, than the vast extent and perfection to which we have carried the contrivance of tools and machines for forming those conveniences of which so large a quantity is consumed by almost every class of the community. The amount of patient thought, of repeated experiment, of happy exertion of genius, by which our manufactures have been created and carried to their present excellence, is scarcely to be imagined. If we look around the rooms we inhabit, or through those storehouses of every convenience, of every luxury that man can desire, which deck the crowded streets of our larger cities, we shall find in the history of each article, of every fabric, the series of failures which have gradually led the way to excellence, and we shall notice, in the art of making even the most insignificant of them, processes calculated to excite our admiration by their simplicity, or to rivet our attention by their unlooked-for results. 2. The accumulation of skill and science which has been directed to diminish the difficulty of producing manufactured goods, has not been beneficial to that country alone in which it is concentrated. Distant kingdoms have participated in its advantages. The luxurious natives of the East and the ruder inhabitants of the African desert are alike indebted to our looms. The produce of our factories has preceded even our most enterprising travelers. 2. The cotton of India is conveyed by British ships round half our planet, to be woven by British skill in the factories of Lancashire. It is again set in motion by British capital, and, transported to the very plains whereon it grew, is repurchased by the lords of the soil which gave it birth, at a cheaper price than that at which their coarser machinery enables them to manufacture it themselves. 3. The large proportion of the population of this country, who are engaged in manufactures, appears from the following table deduced from a statement in an essay on the distribution of wealth, by the Rev. R. Jones. For every 100 persons employed in agriculture, there are agriculturists non-agriculturists. In Bengal 125, in Italy 131, in France 150, in England 100,200. The fact that the proportion of non-agricultural to agricultural persons is continually increasing, appears both from the report of the Committee of the House of Commons upon Manufacturers' Employment, July, L. 830, and from the still later evidence of the last census, from which document the annexed table of the increase of population in our great manufacturing towns has been deduced. Increase of population %. Names of places 180 L 11 18 11 to 21 L 821 31 Total Manchester 22 40 47 151 Glasgow 30 46 38 161 Liverpool for * 26 31 44 138 Nottingham 19 18 25 75 Birmingham 16 24 33 90 Great Britain 14.2 15.7 15.5 52.5. Thus, in 3 periods of 10 years, during each of which the general population of the country has increased about 15%, or about 52% upon the whole period of 30 years, the population of these towns has, on the average, increased 132%. After this statement, there requires no further argument to demonstrate the vast importance to the well-being of this country, of making the interests of its manufacturers well understood and attended to. For the advantages which are derived from machinery and manufactures seem to arise principally from three sources: the addition which they make to human power, the economy they produce of human time, the conversion of substances apparently common and worthless into valuable products. 5. Of additions to human power. With respect to the first of these causes, the forces derived from wind, from water, and from steam, present themselves to the mind of every one. These are, in fact, additions to human power, and will be considered in a future page. There are, however, other sources of its increase, by which the animal force of the individual is itself made to act with far greater than its unassisted power, and to these we shall at present confine our observations. The construction of palaces, of temples, and of tombs, seems to have occupied the earliest attention of nations just entering on the career of civilization, and the enormous blocks of stone moved from their native repositories to minister to the grandeur or piety of the builders, have remained to excite the astonishment of their posterity, long after the purposes of many of these records, as well as the names of their founders, have been forgotten. The different degrees of force necessary to move these ponderous masses will have varied according to the mechanical knowledge of the people employed in their transport, and that the extent of power required for this purpose is widely different under different circumstances, will appear from the following experiment, which is related by M. Rondelet, Suter Lard D. Battier. The block of squared stone was taken for the subject of experiment. LBS 1. Weight of stone 1082. In order to drag this stone along the floor of the quarry, roughly chiseled, it required a force equal to 758.3. The same stone dragged over the floor of planks required 652.4. The same stone placed on a platform of wood, and dragged over the floor of planks, required 606.5. After soaking the two surfaces of wood which slid over each other, it required 182.6. The same stone was now placed upon rollers of 3 inches diameter, when it required to put it in motion along the floor of the quarry 34.7. To drag it by these rollers over a wooden floor 28.8. When the stone was mounted on a wooden platform, and the same rollers placed between that and a plank floor, it required 22. From this experiment it results, that the force necessary to move a stone along part of its weight, the roughly chiseled floor of its quarry, is nearly 2/3 along the wooden floor, 3/5 by wood upon wood, 5/9 if the wooden surfaces are soaked, 1/6 with rollers on the floor of the quarry, 1/32 on rollers on wood, 1/40 on rollers between wood, 1/50. At each increase of knowledge, as well as on the contrivance of every new tool, human labor becomes abridged. The man who contrived rollers invented the tool by which his power was quintupled. The workman who first suggested the employment of soap or grease, was immediately enabled to move, without exerting a greater effort, more than 3 times the weight he could before. 5*6. The economy of human time is the next advantage of machinery in manufactures. So extensive and important is this effect, that we might, if we were inclined to generalize, embrace almost all the advantages under this single head. But the elucidation of principles of less extent will contribute more readily to a knowledge of the subject, and, as numerous examples will be presented to the reader in the ensuing pages, we shall restrict our illustrations upon this point. As an example of the economy of time, the use of gunpowder in blasting rocks may be noticed. Several pounds of powder may be purchased for a sum acquired by a few days' labor, yet when this is employed for the purpose alluded to, effects are frequently produced which could not, even with the best tools, be accomplished by other means in less than many months. The dimensions of one of the blocks of limestone extracted from the quarries worked for the formation of the breakwater at Plymouth were 26½ feet long, 13 feet wide, and 16 feet deep. This mass, containing above 4,800 cubic feet, and weighing about 400 tons, was blasted 3 times. 2 charges of 50 lbs each were successively exploded in a hole 13 feet deep, the bore being 3 inches at top and 2½ inches at bottom. 100 lbs of powder were afterwards exploded in the rent formed by those operations. Each pound of gunpowder separated from the rock 2 tons of matter, or nearly 4,500 times its own weight. The expense of the powder was £6, or nearly 71/2d per pounds. The boring occupied 2 men during a day and a half, and cost about 9s, and the value of the produce was, at that time, about £45. 7. The simple contrivance of tin tubes for speaking through, communicating between different apartments, by which the directions of the superintendent are instantly conveyed to the remotest parts of an establishment, produces a considerable economy of time. It is employed in the shops and manufactories in London, and might with advantage be used in domestic establishments, particularly in large houses, in conveying orders from the nursery to the kitchen, or from the house to the stable. Its convenience arises not merely from saving the servant or workman useless journeys to receive directions, but from relieving the master himself from that indisposition to give trouble, which frequently induces him to forego a trifling want, when he knows that his attendant must mount several flights of stairs to ascertain his wishes, and, after descending, must mount again to supply them. The distance to which such a mode of communication can be extended, does not appear to have been ascertained, and would be an interesting subject for inquiry. Admitting it to be possible between London and Liverpool, about 17 minutes would elapse before the words spoken at one end would reach the other extremity of the pipe. 8. The art of using the diamond for cutting glass has undergone, within a few years, a very important improvement. A glazier's apprentice, when using the diamond set in a conical ferrule, as was always the practice about 20 years since, found great difficulty in acquiring the art of using it with certainty, and, at the end of a 7 years' apprenticeship, many were found but indifferently skilled in its employment. This arose from the difficulty of finding the precise angle at which the diamond cuts, and of guiding it along the glass at the proper inclination when that angle is found. Almost the whole of the time consumed and of the glass destroyed in acquiring the art of cutting glass, may now be saved by the use of an improved tool. The gem is set in a small piece of square brass with its edges nearly parallel to one side of the square. A person skilled in its use now files away the brass on one side until, by trial, he finds that the diamond will make a clean cut, when guided by keeping this edge pressed against a ruler. The diamond and its mounting are now attached to a stick like the pencil, by means of a swivel allowing a small angular motion. Thus, even the beginner at once applies the cutting edge at the proper angle, by pressing the side of the brass against a ruler, and even though the part he holds in his hand should deviate a little from the required angle, it communicates no irregularity to the position of the diamond, which rarely fails to do its office when thus employed. The relative hardness of the diamond, in different directions, is a singular fact. An experienced workman, on whose judgment I can rely, informed me that he has seen a diamond ground with diamond powder on a cast iron mill for 3 hours without its being at all worn, but that, on changing its direction with respect to the grinding surface, the same edge was ground away. 9. Employment of materials of little value. The skins used by the gold beater are produced from the offal of animals. The hoofs of horses and cattle, and other horny refuse, are employed in the production of the prussiate of potash, that beautiful, yellow, crystallized salt, which is exhibited in the shops of some of our chemists. The worn-out saucepans and tinware of our kitchens, when beyond the reach of the tinker's art, are not utterly worthless. We sometimes meet carts loaded with old tin kettles and worn-out iron coal scuttles traversing our streets. These have not yet completed their useful course. The less corroded parts are cut into strips, punched with small holes, and varnished with a coarse black varnish for the use of the trunk maker, who protects the edges and angles of his boxes with them. The remainder are conveyed to the manufacturing chemists in the outskirts of the town, who employ them in combination with pyridinous acid, in making the black dye for the use of calico printers. 10. Of tools. The difference between the tool and machine is not capable of very precise distinction, nor is it necessary, in a popular explanation of those terms, to limit very strictly their acceptation. The tool is usually more simple than a machine. It is generally used with the hand, whilst the machine is frequently moved by animal or steam power. The simpler machines are often merely one or more tools placed in a frame, and acted on by moving power. In pointing out the advantages of tools, we shall commence with some of the simplest. 11. To arrange 20,000 needles thrown promiscuously into a box, mixed and entangled in every possible direction, in such a form that they shall be all parallel to each other, would, at first sight, appear the most tedious occupation. In fact, if each needle were to be separated individually, many hours must be consumed in the process. Yet this is an operation which must be performed many times in the manufacture of needles, and it is accomplished in a few minutes by a very simple tool, nothing more being requisite than a small flat tray of sheet iron, slightly concave at the bottom. In this the needles are placed, and shaken in a peculiar manner, by throwing them up a very little, and giving at the same time a slight longitudinal motion to the tray. The shape of the needles assists their arrangement, for if two needles cross each other unless, which is exceedingly improbable, they happen to be precisely balanced, they will, then they fall on the bottom of the tray, tend to place themselves side by side, and the hollow form of the tray assists this disposition. As they have no projection in any part to impede this tendency, or to entangle each other, they are, by continually shaking, arranged lengthwise, in 3 or 4 minutes. The direction of the shake is now changed, the needles are but little thrown up, but the tray is shaken end piece, the result of which is, that in a minute or two the needles which were previously arranged end piece become heaped up in the wall, with their ends against the extremity of the tray. They are then removed, by hundreds at a time, with a broad iron spatula, on which they are retained by the forefinger of the left hand. As this parallel arrangement of the needles must be repeated many times, if a cheap and expeditious method had not been devised, the expense of the manufacture would have been considerably enhanced. 12. Another process in the art of making needles furnishes an example of one of the simplest contrivances which can come under the denomination of a tool. After the needles have been arranged in the manner just described, it is necessary to separate them into 2 parcels, in order that their points may be all in one direction. This is usually done by women and children. The needles are placed sideways in a heap, on a table, in front of each operator, just as they are arranged by the process above described. From 5 to 10 are rolled towards this person with the forefinger of the left hand. This separates them a very small space from each other, and each in its turn is pushed lengthwise to the right or to the left, according to the direction of the point. This is the usual process, and in it every needle passes individually under the finger of the operator. A small alteration expedites the process considerably. The child puts on the forefinger of its right hand a small cloth cap or finger stall, and rolling out of the heap from 6 to 12 needles, he keeps them down by the forefinger of the left hand, whilst he presses the forefinger of the right hand gently against their ends. Those which have the points towards the right hand stick into the finger stall, and the child, removing the finger of the left hand, slightly raises the needles sticking into the cloth, and then pushes them towards the left side. Those needles which had their eyes on the right hand do not stick into the finger cover, and are pushed to the heap on the right side before the repetition of this process. By means of this simple contrivance each movement of the finger, from one side to the other, carries 5 or 6 needles to their proper heap, whereas, in the former method, frequently only one was moved, and rarely more than 2 or 3 were transported at one movement to their place. 13. Various operations occur in the arts in which the assistance of an additional hand would be a great convenience to the workman, and in these cases tools or machines of the simplest structure come to our aid. Vices of different forms, in which the material to be wrought is firmly grasped by screws, are of this kind, and are used in almost every workshop, but a more striking example may be found in the trade of a nail maker. Some kinds of nails, such as those used for defending the soles of coarse shoes, called hobnails, require a particular form of the head, which is made by the stroke of a die. The workman holds one end of the rod of iron out of which he forms the nails in his left hand. With his right hand he hammers the red-hot end of it into a point, and cutting the proper length almost off, bends it nearly at a right angle. He puts this into a hole in a small stake iron immediately under a hammer which is connected with a treadle, and has a die sunk in its surface corresponding to the intended form of the head, and having given one part of the form to the head with a small hammer in his hand, he moves the treadle with his foot, disengages the other hammer, and completes the figure of the head. the returning stroke produced by the movement of the treadle striking the finished nail out of the hole in which it was retained. Without this substitution of his foot for another hand, the workman would, probably, be obliged to heat the nails twice over. 14. Another, though fortunately a less general substitution of tools for human hands, is used to assist the labor of those who are deprived by nature, or by accident, of some of their limbs. Those who have had an opportunity of examining the beautiful contrivances for the manufacture of shoes by machinery, which we owe to the fertile invention of Mr. Brunel, must have noticed many instances in which the workmen were enabled to execute their task with precision, although laboring under the disadvantages of the loss of an arm or leg. A similar instance occurs at Liverpool, in the Institution for the Blind, where a machine is used by those afflicted with blindness, for weaving sash lines. It is said to have been the invention of a person suffering under that calamity. Other examples might be mentioned of contrivances for the use, the amusement, or the instruction of the wealthier classes, who labor under the same natural disadvantages. These triumphs of skill and ingenuity deserve a double portion of our admiration when applied to mitigate the severity of natural or accidental misfortune. Then they supply the rich with occupation and knowledge, when they relieve the poor from the additional evils of poverty and want. 15. Division of the objects of machinery. There exists a natural, although, in point of number, a very unequal division amongst machines. They may be classed as, first, those which are employed to produce power, and as, secondly, those which are intended merely to transmit force and execute work. The first of these divisions is of great importance, and is very limited in the variety of its species, although some of those species consist of numerous individuals. Of that class of mechanical agents by which motion is transmitted, the lever, the pulley, the wedge, and many others, it has been demonstrated that no power is gained by their use, however combined. Whatever force is applied at one point can only be exerted at some other, diminished by friction and other incidental causes, and it has been further proved that whatever is gained in the rapidity of execution is compensated by the necessity of exerting additional force. These two principles, long since placed beyond the reach of doubt, cannot be too constantly borne in mind. But in limiting our attempts to things which are possible, we are still, as we hope to show, possessed of a field of inexhaustible research, and of advantages derived from mechanical skill, which have but just begun to exercise their influence on our hearts, and may be pursued without limit, contributing to the improvement, the wealth, and the happiness of our race. 16. Of those machines by which we produce power, it may be observed, that although they are to us immense acquisitions, yet in regard to two of the sources of this power, the force of wine and of water, we merely make use of bodies in a state of motion by nature. We change the directions of their movement in order to render them subservient to our purposes, but we neither add to nor diminish the quantity of motion in existence. When we expose the sails of a windmill obliquely to the gale, we check the velocity of a small portion of the atmosphere, and convert its own rectilinear motion into one of rotation in the sails. We thus change the direction of force, but we create no power. The same may be observed with regard to the sails of a vessel. The quantity of motion given by them is precisely the same as that which is destroyed in the atmosphere. If we avail ourselves of a descending stream to turn a water wheel, we are appropriating the power which nature may appear, at first sight, to be uselessly and irrecoverably wasting, but which, upon due examination, we shall find she is ever regaining by other processes. The fluid which is falling from a higher to a lower level, carries with it the velocity due to its revolution with the earth at a greater distance from its center. It will therefore accelerate, although to an almost infinitesimal extent, the earth's daily rotation. The sum of all these increments of velocity, arising from the descent of all the falling waters on the earth's surface, would in time become perceptible, did not nature, by the process of evaporation, convey the waters back to their sources, and thus again, by removing matter to a greater distance from the center, destroy the velocity generated by its previous approach. 17. The force of vapor is another fertile source of moving power, but even in this case it cannot be maintained that power is created. Water is converted into elastic vapor by the combustion of fuel. The chemical changes which thus take place are constantly increasing the atmosphere by large quantities of carbonic acid and other gases noxious to animal life. The means by which nature decomposes these elements, or reconverts them into a solid form, are not sufficiently known, but if the end could be accomplished by mechanical force, it is almost certain that the power necessary to produce it would at least equal that which was generated by the original combustion. Man, therefore, does not create power, but, availing himself of his knowledge of nature's mysteries, he applies his talents to diverting a small and limited portion of her energies to his own wants, and, whether he employs the regulated action of steam, or the more rapid and tremendous effects of gunpowder, he is only producing on a small scale compositions and decompositions which nature is incessantly at work in reversing, for the restoration of that equilibrium which we cannot doubt is constantly maintained throughout even the remotest limits of our system. The operations of man participate in the character of their author. They are diminutive, but energetic during the short period of their existence, whilst those of nature, acting over vast spaces, and unlimited by time, are ever pursuing their silent and resistless career. 18. In stating the broad principle, that all combinations of mechanical art can only augment the force communicated to the machine at the expense of the time employed in producing the effect, it might, perhaps, be imagined, that the assistance derived from such contrivances is small. This is, however, by no means the case, since the almost unlimited variety they afford, enables us to exert to the greatest advantage whatever force we employ. There is, it is true, a limit beyond which it is impossible to reduce the power necessary to produce any given effect, but it very seldom happens that the methods first employed at all approach that limit. In dividing the knotted root of a tree for fuel, how very different will be the time consumed, according to the nature of the tool made use of. The hatchet, or the axe, will divide it into small parts, but will consume a large portion of the workman's time. The saw will answer the same purpose more quickly and more effectually. This, in its turn, is superseded by the wedge, which rends it in a still shorter time. If the circumstances are favorable, and the workman skillful, the time and expense may be still further reduced by the use of a small quantity of gunpowder exploded in holes judiciously placed in the block. 19. When a mass of matter is to be removed, a certain force must be expended, and upon the proper economy of this force the price of transport will depend. The country must, however, have reached a high degree of civilization before it will have approached the limit of this economy. The cotton of Java is conveyed in junks to the coast of China, but from the seed not being previously separated, 3/4 of the weight thus carried is not cotton. This might, perhaps, be justified in Java by the want of machinery to separate the seed, or by the relative cost of the operation in the two countries. But the cotton itself, as packed by the Chinese, occupies 3 times the bulk of an equal quantity shipped by Europeans for their own markets. Thus the freight of a given quantity of cotton costs the Chinese nearly 12 times the price to which, by a proper attention to mechanical methods, it might be reduced. Asterisk notes. 1. The bandana handkerchiefs manufactured at Glasgow have long superseded the genuine ones, and are now committed in large quantities both by the natives and Shins. Crawford's Indian Archipelago, Volume II, page 505. 2. Captain Clapperton, when on a visit at the court of the Sultan Bellows, states that provisions were regularly sent me from the Sultan's table on pewter dishes with the London stamp, and I even had a piece of meat served up on a whitewash hand basin of English manufacture. Clapperton's Journey, page 88. 3. That Calicut, in the East Indies whence the cotton cloth tailed calico derives its name, the price of labour is 1/7 of that in England, yet the market is supplied from British looms. 4. Liverpool, though not itself a manufacturing town, has been placed in this list, from its connection with Manchester, of which it is the port. 5. So sensible are the effects of grease in diminishing friction, that the drivers of sledges in Amsterdam, on which heavy goods are transported, carry in their hand a rope soaked in tallow, which they throw down from time to time before the sledge, in order that, by passing over the rope, it may become greased.